Amendments were constructed. The 14th Amendment goes on to say that no state can abridge a citizen's right to life, liberty, and the ownership of property. That's the way they interpret Jefferson's pursuit of happiness, the ownership of property. But then it says, except by due process of law. So what does that mean? Once the due process of law has occurred, the state or the federal government can abridge, can revoke, can limit, can restrict the citizenship of someone that's been convicted of a crime. So the 13th and the 14th Amendment are perfect companions. The 13th abolishes slavery, and then it reinstituted as a government-run institution and throughout the United States of America. The 14th Amendment describes who can get citizenship, and then it describes how that citizenship can be taken away by the government that has granted it. Now we got a better understanding as to where we are today. It's not merely mass incarceration, it is over-criminalization, over-prosecution, over-incarceration. It is not about collateral consequence, it is intended consequences to marginalize people that have been convicted by the criminal justice system, to permanently relegate them not merely to an underclass, but to an undercaste. And that was done to make sure that there would always be a captive labor pool to do the work that many people did not want to do. But they never imagined that our economy would become the envy of the world with technological advances and robotics and advanced manufacturing. So now we do not need a massive permanent underclass of people to do this work because we're needing fewer and fewer people to do work as we become more and more efficient with technology. So now what we've created is this mass of people, and the federal government estimate is 40 to 60 million. We don't even keep an accurate number, but according to the United States Justice Department Statistical Analysis Center, they estimate between 40 to 60 million Americans that have felons. That's a nation. That's larger than any nation in the Middle East, nations in Europe. It's an entire nation that can be legally discriminated against. So the 14th Amendment no longer applies equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment doesn't apply while they're still under correctional supervision in most states because they can't vote. In some states, they permanently lose disenfranchisement. They can no longer serve on a jury. They can no longer own legally a firearm. They can be discriminated against for housing, for employment, for Pell Grants, for food stamps. In essence, they can be discriminated for about just anything that someone wants to discriminate them for. And as a matter of fact, we passed every laws to increase their discrimination. So that's the real problem. And that's why the solutions that are postulated are woefully inadequate. I support my colleagues who've tried to move forward a legislation in West Virginia, a felony expungement, basically, but it will accomplish very little. The statute says after 10 years, a person can apply to have their record expunged. Well, if they get that their record expunged, there's something called the World Wide Web. And so a person then could just Google that person's name, and it would be out there they've had a felony conviction, and therefore they still can legally discriminate against them. So it will accomplish very little in terms of protecting people against discrimination. Trying to help people understand the size of the problem. And so when you understand that it is my position, I think it's supported by data and statistics, is that the felony population that is concentrated in certain areas, whether it be urban centers where the war on drugs really targeted, small urban places and some rural places, it may very well be the number one factor that sustains and that perpetuates systemic generational poverty. Because it affects the whole community, because there are a number of people in these communities that are underemployed or that are unemployed and that they're legally discriminated against. So for the children are going to live their entire lifetime in poverty, and therefore you're going to see very little movement. And you see very little movement in a place like West Virginia, moving people out of poverty. Now specifically, take a look at West Virginia, one of the smallest states in the Union, one of only 2 states that's actually losing population, West Virginia and Michigan. Michigan because of the decline of Detroit. But we have a higher rate of population loss than any other state. And in 2020, for the first time in many years, West Virginia's population is projected to have declined. Not only we have out-migration exceeding immigration, but we also, our birth rates are exceeding our death rates. So we got a combination of problems. 1.852 million people, give or take a few. 150,000 that are felons. That's 10% of the adult population that are felons. 130 of the 150 plus million actually have discharged their sentences, and they are now eligible to vote. Now, this could be the political game changer. I call them the sleeping giant around the country and the sleeping giant in West Virginia. The sleeping giant in West Virginia are the group that I call the Rodney Dangerfields. They get absolutely no respect. They are the convicted felons. They have no real standing. They can be legally discriminated against. They're considered to be irrelevant. But they are the potential sleeping giant that could change the trajectory of just about every race in the state of West Virginia if they got out in large numbers along with their families and actually cast their vote. Get registered and get out and cast their vote. They could turn every election. And then they could then force the two political parties to place on the agenda at the West Virginia State Legislature and within the executive branch a real agenda to address poverty, a real agenda to move and to develop the people in the places where these people live. It could send a political tsunami shockwave through the entire state of West Virginia that would resonate all over the country if a significant portion of the 130 plus thousand and their family members. So now you're talking probably close to 200, 300,000 people that are directly connected to the felon. And that's the only way I believe you're going to see true change and true prison reform. Because it's my humble opinion that what really is needed is not merely felony expungement. It's not going to accomplish a lot. Even the federal legislation they're discussing, they call prison reform. Now note, President Trump knows what he's talking about in the words, prison reform. He's talking about reforming stuff inside the prison. So the training that people get inside the prison, how the prisons are run and those type of things, prison reform. The Senator Grassley out of Iowa, he was saying no. He's saying we need sentencing reform. And Grassley had a bill back in 2016. There was sentencing reform that reduced the mandatory minimum sentencing. There would be no lifetime sentences for juveniles. They would have to give you an opportunity at parole. No lifetime for a certain drug felon. So there's sentencing reform that needs to occur. And then there is correctional reform I think that needs to happen in terms of eliminating some of these laws that now give judges the option of incarcerating people. And there are many laws that nonviolent defendants where there's no real victim per se, that there probably should be alternative sentences like day report, like home confinement, like community service, like maintaining employment, rather than sticking these people away in cages. But the big idea of what really has to happen to fix this problem, because the real problem is that over-criminalization, over-prosecution, over-incarceration, intended collateral consequences has created a permanent undercast of people, and they're locked there at the bottom. And the only way they could get out would be a pathway to full citizenship restoration. Because here's what happened as I close this narrative. That when the 13th and 14th Amendments were passed, ratified by the states, what they did, they created what I call a citizenship twilight zone for anybody convicted of a crime. Now, for those of you who are under the age of probably 50, you may not be familiar with the Twilight Zone. But the Twilight Zone was a movie, a TV series. Rod Serling, he was kind of an interesting guy, and he had these real interesting stories that he wanted to put on the television screen. And a lot of us was intrigued by it. So what the Twilight Zone was, it was an alternate universe. Somebody would wake up one day and they'd be in a different place. It wasn't like the world they were in the day before. And very often the Twilight Zone, when you got locked in it, you couldn't get out of it. You were just in this citizenship, cultural no man's land. That's where the felons are. They're in the Twilight Zone of citizenship, no man's land. They're not illegal immigrants. They're not here on a work visa, right? They were born or naturalized with full citizenship. Then they committed a crime and was convicted. Technically, they then were a slave of the state. And then after discharging their sentence, they were released from slavery, from bondage, but they were not restored their citizenship. So they're in the twilight zone of no man's land citizenship. The only way to fix this problem is a constitutional amendment at the federal level that will require pathways to full citizenship restoration, which would then require every state to pass legislation that would provide a pathway to full citizenship restoration. And so I invite a debate on this issue. And I invite the legal scholars and the constitutional scholars, let's have a conversation and vet and challenge everything I've said in this presentation. I believe that it will stand historical rigor because it's well documented in terms of what happened after Reconstruction in the South, and the fact that there was a need for a civil rights bill. Think about this, a civil rights bill in 1964 when the 14th Amendment was supposed to give an equal protection under the law. But we had to get a civil rights bill to restore what the 14th Amendment was supposed to have done. And why do we need a voters' rights bill in 1965 when the 15th Amendment was supposed to give voting rights to all of the ex-slaves and all citizens? It's because the criminal justice system was used by the South basically to revoke all those rights. And that's why I say the Constitution leaves the convicted individual in the twilight zone of citizenship no man's land. And all the other conversation we are having is good conversation to have, but it's not going to address the ultimate problem. What do we do with 40 to 60 million people in the United States of America who are no longer full citizens, who are trapped in what Dr. Martin Luther King described as the lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast sea of material prosperity? What do we do with the 150,000 felons in West Virginia and their families, which comprise much of the 330,000 people in West Virginia that are in poverty? They're connected to this felony population. What do we do with them? What we need to do is provide a pathway to full citizenship restoration so these individuals can no longer be discriminated against, so that they can compete for employment and they can have all their rights restored back to them to where they can be full citizens again in this great nation. And that is the pathway for healing that we so desperately need. I'm out of my time. I thank you for yours.